Idaho College and this evening's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Welcome. Today we wish to continue our series that we have been doing over the past 6 months and will continue through this year of 10 programs that we're bringing to you from time to time on a topic entitled Alcohol and Human Values. This is a series of public forums that are presented by the Association for the Humanities in Idaho and the Kootenai County Council on Alcoholism. Tonight we wish to deal with the topic of loss, loneliness, and liquor. In order to accomplish this particular topic and this program both this week and next week, it is my pleasure to welcome to our program the Reverend James E. Royce. He is a Jesuit priest, a professional psychologist, and the director of the Alcohol Studies program at Seattle University. He is a member of the Board of Directors of the National Council on Alcoholism and longtime member of the Executive Committee of the Washington State Council on Alcoholism. He was elected a fellow of the American Psychological Association and has been president of 2 national psychology associations. He has 2 books that have been translated into Spanish, and one has also been translated into Italian, and he recently completed a comprehensive college-level textbook on alcoholism, which will be published in 1980. Father Royce, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
Joining this evening in questioning our guest are 3 members that have been involved with this grant from the beginning and will be with us on all 10 programs. First of all is Mr. Tim Pilgrim, who teaches in the field of speech and also is the debate coach at North Idaho College. Welcome once again, Tim.
Thank you.
Also, Judy Silty, who is a member of the English department and faculty. Welcome, Judy.
Thank you.
And also Jim McLeod in the field of English and poetry. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you.
We'll commence the questioning in a few moments. I would just like to make a couple of more points concerning this. It's been several weeks since we have done this series. First of all, we did one on alcohol and industry, a second one on alcohol and the law. This evening, as I've indicated, again, next week we wish to deal with senior citizens and their relationship to the question of alcohol. We will proceed with the questioning from Tim Christie.
Thank you, Tony. Father Royce, how extensive is the drinking problem among the elderly today, and what kind of statistical knowledge do we have about the situation?
Well, the honest answer is that we don't have good statistical knowledge about alcoholism among the elderly. It's hard to get accurate figures, but there's increased amount of research recently, and the whole trend of that is to indicate that the problem is very serious, that the per capita rate of alcoholism among senior citizens, people over 65, is probably higher than in the general population.
Okay, Judy Sildy.
Yes, Father Royce, just to clarify our terms here, how are we defining a problem drinker? Or is that the same as an alcoholic, for example?
For research purposes, we have to be more precise, but most people, even those in the field who are research-oriented now, are tending to blur the use of the terms problem drinker and alcoholic into one, because if you have a problem with alcohol, that is, if alcohol is causing a serious problem in any major area of your life, your health, your job, your marriage, or your social relationships, or whatever, you have a problem. And whether you call it alcoholism or mashed potatoes, it's still a real problem. As I say, for research purposes, we do try to be a little more precise on the definition of alcoholic, but what I have said is a practical working definition of an alcoholic.
Jim McLeod.
Father Royce, a few months ago, there was a national article, I believe it was in Newsweek, on teenage alcoholism and its epidemic proportions in our society. How does this sort of thing compare with the same problem with aged in our culture? Is it as great a problem for them as well?
Well, alcoholism among youth is certainly a very serious problem. We now know that there are many teenagers who are in serious trouble. with the drug alcohol. However, I think we have to be careful. Some of that smacks a bit of the scare story approach, and people always want to get excited about youth, when actually many of these young drinkers will not become alcoholics. Even the kids who get drunk the Friday or Saturday night kegger and so forth, they aren't really alcoholics. Some of them are. But probably the problem among the elderly is more serious than people realize, where we have, if anything, a tendency to perhaps exaggerate among the young people. We underestimate the seriousness of the problem among the older people.
Why do you suppose we hear so little about this subject and so little attention is given to it?
Oh, for a variety of reasons. For one thing, youth is always of interest. We are a youth-oriented society, and anything that has to do with young people will almost invariably will get more attention. Secondly, the problem among the elderly is often hidden. People are not aware of it, even the professionals, because, well, several reasons. For one thing, they don't get diagnosed as alcoholics. Very often, the medical complications of alcoholism are so intertwined with a lot of the things that could pass for just aging that the diagnosis is not made as sharply as it should. Then also, the older people don't lose jobs, or they don't have a job, so they don't become involved in the industrial business scene where we have rather accurate research and statistics. Very often they have no spouse, their spouse is separated or divorced or deceased. And for a variety of reasons, they don't create as much problem. They often drink themselves to death very quietly in front of the TV, rather than being out in the streets as the youngsters are, more boisterous, or even the middle-aged alcoholic who is driving a car and gets arrested for drunk driving. The elderly people who have problems with alcohol tend to hide them, and since they're buried in their home or apartment, they are less likely to become counted, to become statistics, so to speak, and hence that we don't get that much attention. Also, old age tends not to be as glamorous as youth, perhaps, and therefore we don't give it the attention that we might.
Ladies and gentlemen, on the first part of this program, we've been talking about the scope of the problem of alcoholism as it relates to senior citizens and their loneliness. We want to return to the panel, and in doing so, I want to introduce Tim Christie. I call him Tim Pilgrim, who's also on our faculty. I've been working with for the past 2 weeks, and I think I had him on my mind. Tim Christie will ask the next series of questions.
Thank
and we'll
you.
now deal with the causes of alcoholism.
Okay. Thank you, Tony. Father Royce, what do you think is the cause behind the trend, or I mean, what's behind the statistics? Are the elderly drinking for some reason different than, say, the more youth-oriented society, or what's the rationale behind this?
Well,
increase?
let me first say that although I am a professional psychologist, I feel that we have spent entirely too much time talking about causes. The average alcoholic or problem drinker begins drinking for the same reason everybody else does: relaxation, to be social, custom, habit, whatever. And you can waste a lot of time getting nowhere analyzing causes. So many old people say begin at least drinking for the same reason as everybody else. I would say that there are some problems peculiar to the aging process which do create added reasons why older people can get into trouble with alcohol. I think that's certainly true. But I think we also have to recognize that alcohol is an addictive drug. It's a selectively addictive drug. Not everybody who drinks gets in trouble. Most people can drink all their lives without having any problem. But once you recognize that it is a physiological addiction that's involved here, then you have to recognize that some people are more prone to it. They're more vulnerable, so to speak. Other people are more immune. As a result, we have really three different classes of older people who get in trouble with alcohol. First of all, there are those who really have had a problem all their life. They may not have recognized it or admitted it, or they may have tried to do something about it, actually stopped for a while. And these people seem to suddenly become alcoholics in old age. It's just because the problem has now surfaced. For the first time, it's become obvious, because up until retirement, they have hewed the line because of their job, their marriage, whatever. So that's one group. There really have been alcoholics a great deal of their life, but it just never came to the surface before. Secondly, there are those who are physiologically vulnerable but never drank much before. And they don't have the long history of drinking that the first group did. So for them, it's more a question that due to the changes of retirement or the death of a spouse or whatever, all of a sudden they start drinking and become into an acute stage very quickly because they've really been vulnerable all along. The third group, and they're the ones that we can help most readily, are those who are simply reacting to the changes of old age. And those are the ones that most people understand more readily because they're the causes of their problem drinking are more directly tied up with what happens when they get too old.
Judy Sildy.
Yes, I'm quite interested in what you're saying about that. The title of our public forum, and for that matter of tonight's program, on the use and abuse of alcohol among the aging was Loss, Loneliness, and Liquor. What, Father Royce, are some of the more important losses that you see as contributing to many older persons drinking?
Well, certainly the loss of job or retirement is an important one, especially for the male. The men in America are very much tied up with their job, so that is a big loss for them, and they react to that. It may be the death of a spouse. It may be the fear of their own death. There are illness problems. But among the big psychological ones, I would say, are the boredom of retirement, the sense of non-productive life, that they no longer feel important, that there's a loss of status because there are no, ours is very much of a production-oriented society. We have rather materialistic values in that respect, and so when they are no longer productive citizens, I think this is a blow to their ego, and I think this is terribly important. Also, many of their friends have died, so there is definitely a sense of loneliness. Then some of them get depressed, some of them get worried about the problems of old age, and there's an anxiety developed, so that all of these reasons certainly add to the likelihood of getting into trouble with alcohol among older people who drink.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you've joined our program in progress, our guest this evening is the director of the Alcohol Studies program at Seattle University, the Reverend James E. Royce. We're dealing with alcoholism as it relates to the elderly, or as we often entitle it for this program, Loss, Loneliness, and Liquor. We shall continue the questioning with Jim McLeod.
Father Royce, to get back to that issue of self-worth, don't you think that in a culture that places less and less value on the worth of the non-productive and the obsolete, it's only natural to see more and more of the older neighbors feeling loss, resentment, and displacement in our society?
Yeah, I certainly do. I would agree very much that we do not have the same attitudes toward the value of the older citizens as in many countries. In China, for instance, the older people are highly respected. They are looked to as a source of wisdom and experience, and they are kept as part of the family. And we have lost almost entirely that tradition. And I think it's a great loss to all of us, because these elderly people have a great deal that they could contribute to our society if we'd only let them. But because of the fact that our society tends to ignore the contributions that they could make, we, I think, almost force them into a position of loneliness and a feeling that they are not important.
Tim Christie.
Thank you, Tony. Yes, Dr. Royce, it seems to be that there's a lot of parallels with the last forum that we did, which was on alcohol and the Native Americans, and I'm struck by the parallel between both the Native Americans in terms of their cultural loss, their loss of their lands, traditions, etc., and the losses that the elderly are suffering as well. Do you see that same parallel?
There certainly is a parallel, although, again, in spite of being a psychologist, I have to be cautious about over-psychologizing here. Again, I think we have to remind ourselves that alcohol is a physically addictive drug, and regardless of the reasons, some people who use it are going to develop serious problems. And say the reasons why can sometimes be exaggerated, but certainly I see a definite parallel. The sense of displacement, as I say, unlike the Chinese culture, for instance, where our older people just almost in a sense don't have a home. They are not in at least a prominent position very often in our sense of values, and I think this hurts. And our values just aren't too clear now. I think sometimes that as a nation, by and large, we don't know what we think about our older citizens. Sometimes we pay lip service to a lot of respect to the elderly, but I'm afraid that sometimes we don't practice what we preach, that in our practice we may give them cheaper rates on a few things, public transportation or whatnot, but that as far as our whole involvement with them as persons, we do not show at least the respect that we claim we have for them. And so I think there is a parallel there with what's happened to our Native American Indians. It's a complex thing. I think that one of the important facts is the question of change. Now, I've mentioned China a couple of times. China is a civilization thousands of years old and with long and strong traditions. Also would be true of the Orthodox Jews, for instance. And those peoples have low rates of alcoholism, and they have a high respect for the older people. We are in a civilization that's changing so rapidly that whether or not you agree with Toffler's future shock, he may or may not be correct in all his facts, but the general thrust of the book is that the rate of change is occurring so rapidly now that we just can't count on what's going to be true next week. And I think this kind of thing is very upsetting, both to the very old and to the very young.
Father Royce, in answering Tim Chris's question concerning a comparison with American natives and Jim McLeod's concerning teenagers, I would like to pursue this one step further and ask you, and you've already touched on that in relation to China and the Orthodox Jewish community, is there any difference in the alcohol problem among senior citizens in different parts of the United States? Is it indicated by region that there could be a greater problem in some sections than other ones?
I don't think that the research has been precise enough to have much on that as far as different regions of the United States. Yes, there are some differences. They tend to go not so much by the sheer geography as by the ethnic background. We know that certain peoples have low rates of alcoholism per capita, and other races have very high rates. Now, the United States is a melting pot, and as these different peoples have intermixed and even intermarried, the lines become blurred, and it's very difficult to be nice and neat and precise. But in general, those people of southern Mediterranean stock, I mentioned the Jews, the Greeks, the southern wine-drinking Italians. You have to make that distinction now because the northern industrial Italy is starting to have some serious problems with alcohol. But the southern wine-drinking Italians, if they stay in the old family customs, have very low rates of alcoholism. Whereas the Nordic peoples, including the Irish, the Celts, and the North American Indians and Eskimo tend to have definitely a higher rate of alcoholism. And although there are some cultural differences, I think a lot of it is tied up with this physiological vulnerability that I mentioned, whereas we haven't had 20, 30,000 years to build up some immunity. And I think this is part of the problem, so that in those parts of the country which are heavily populated by the peoples who biologically seem to have better immunity, you have lower rates. And vice versa, where you have Nordic peoples or those where there is a higher rate generally, you're also going to find high rates among the older people. One of the things we find out is that this is not a self-limiting disease, the disease of alcoholism. And I don't think we referred to it as an illness so far, at least in this program. But it is an illness, and it's not a self-limiting illness. Drinking increases actually very often in old age, not decreases by any automatic process of self-elimination.
On behalf of the panel, I want to express our appreciation to Father Royce for the comments he's made, and I want to stop at this point to indicate to you, as I introduced him, I made the comment that he has published a textbook that will come out in 1980 on alcohol and responsibility. I have with me a pamphlet that shows one chapter that is in this book. This particular pamphlet is called Alcohol and Responsibility, and this will be coming out next year in the form of a textbook. At this time, we would like to invite our panel to have an interchange concerning this topic. As I indicated at the beginning of the program also, they've been involved in this grant for over 2 years, writing it and preparing it, and now they are involved in the administration of it in the programs that are being not only on this show, but also brought to the public in Coeur d'Alene and Kootenai County. At this time, we will ask Jim McLeod to make some comments.
I just would like to agree with this matter that I think Father Royce has addressed himself to about conflicting values in our culture. And I guess quite aside from some of the more specific value questions that relate to the topics, is how we really feel about the aging in a culture infatuated with the new and young. There's the even more general confusion of the conflicting values of tradition and self-restraint versus libertarianism and permissiveness. After all, I guess it's kind of unrealistic to expect that Grandma and Grandpa will be immune to the do-your-own-thing, or if it feels good, do it ethic when nobody else is in our society.
Right, and isn't it true that we often expect it anyway, no matter how much we may realize, at least rationally, that it is pretty unrealistic? I, for one, am very aware of feeling that way myself. Some sort of expectation down underneath, anyway, that the older generation is going to be able to maintain some kind of clarity of values, some traditional role or model of behavior that the rest of us are often much too confused to maintain. And I wonder if this doesn't have something to do with the whole question of how hidden the problem we're talking about today is, how little attention we see to it. Perhaps that's why we all, in a sense at least, conspire to keep it hidden. If we talked more about problems like this among the elderly, I think maybe we'd all have to confront a lot of change and confusion in our whole culture that we just as soon not have to acknowledge. It's a theory anyway.
Father Royce, a thought that just came up is, do you think that probably the problem of drinking or alcoholism or problem drinking, whatever we want to call it, is really a larger symptom or a symptom of a larger disease within the entire society as a whole, or at least a pain of our society in terms of the way that we're trying to grow, and that in fact it's a symptom of Toffler's future shock kind of thing?
I think so. We have to remind ourselves that although the problem is getting studied now, and thank God we are getting it out in the open, as Judith said, that it's coming out from the closet, and we're facing it. I think that's very good, and in fact, I think it's absolutely necessary if we're going to make any progress in doing something about it. We've got to get it out in the open and talk about it. However, I think we have to keep some balance here. We do not want to sound like prohibitionists. We know that prohibition has been tried not only in our country, it's been tried in England, it's been tried in China, it's been tried in many countries, and has been abandoned every time. It just doesn't seem to work. Alcohol has been around since before literate society, before man could write. There is evidence in prehistoric society of the fermentation, at least, of beer and wine, distillation itself, although it's sometimes dated as far as becoming common in our Western civilization, somewhere between 1000 and 1500 BC, AD, the time when the distilled spirits or liquor came into Europe. But actually, distillation goes back among the Arabs and the Chinese perhaps 2,000 years before Christ. So there is no question that we're going to just do anything immediately that's going to change this problem drastically. It's been around a long time. It will be around. We have to work at changing attitudes. I think that's absolutely crucial. And changing these attitudes is not easy, but it can be done. We have changed our attitudes in this country, for instance, with regard to some very basic things. Matter of flying in airplanes. I can remember as a child when the commercial airliners first were starting to convince people that that was something you do, was to fly. And of course the answer was, if God wanted man to fly, give him wings. But it's a fact that we have changed our attitudes, and this, many other things. So we're seeing now some definite changes with regard to smoking, for instance. And so I think that's, in the long run, is what we're going to have to do. But we have to be a little bit relaxed about it. It's a serious problem, and we need to work on it. But on the other hand, say we can't panic or come off as so rigid and puritanical and prohibitionistic that we just turn people off and they won't listen to us. Say it's been around a long time. Many people can drink socially or moderately all their lives without getting into serious trouble. We have to recognize that people differ. I think that's one of the things that has been missed up till this time in alcohol education. We assume that everybody reacts the same to alcohol, and that's simply not true. We know that some people get high on morphine, some people get depressed on speed or amphetamines. Why should we assume that everybody reacts the same to alcohol? Some people get hives when they eat strawberries, some people are allergic to crab or whatever. So I think we have to recognize that people differ, and we cannot assume that everybody's going to react the same.
Father Royce, on this program concerning alcoholism, at an earlier time, one of our guests indicated that about 1 out of every 8 that consume alcohol have a problem. Would you agree with that statistic?
Well, I think it's important for credibility's sake to be very conservative in our figures. If we come off sounding like scare stories, the people, and especially young people, are simply not going to believe anything we say. I've heard figures as low as 1 in 8. I think that is a little bit high. 1 in 10 or even 1 in 12 is more conservative, but as I say, I think credibility is important here. But if we say that 1 person out of a dozen who uses alcohol is going to get into serious trouble with it, that still means that we're going to be talking about around 9-10 million alcoholics in the United States. Add to that the 4 or 5 other people, spouse, children, employer, employee, who are affected. We're talking about seriously messing up the lives of 40 or 50 million people. So it's a big problem. There's no need to exaggerate.
With that, I have to bring our program to conclusion, and on behalf of our staff at North Idaho College and in relation to the North Idaho College Public Forum, I want to express an appreciation to you and the panel for all the work you've done on this very, very important topic. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be with you again next week, when we're going to be fortunate to have as our guest Father Royce, and we're going to pursue at that time the effects and the possible solutions to alcoholism in the elderly, or this topic of loss, loneliness, and liquor as it relates to the elderly. For you who have been hearing this program and others that we've been bringing you over the past year, I would like to invite you, if you have any further questions, to call the Kootenai County Council on Alcoholism, and that number is area code 208-667-9591. They have a professional staff that could certainly address your questions and your concerns. If you live in Canada or in Spokane or in Montana, I would urge you to consult with the telephone directory for the center in your locality, and they can assist you too. I know they have a very effective center in Spokane. May I also take this opportunity to say to the 3 panel members, Tim Christie and Judy Sildy and Jim McLeod, my many thanks to you. I know this has been a very long project, but a very exciting one for you, and you have put in much time and worked hard to bring these guests to our community and have the public forums to the community, and then also join us on this program. We appreciate that and welcome you back next week when we shall continue this with Father Royce. Until that time, I wish you a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time. To the campus of North Idaho College and this evening's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Welcome. We wish to bring you another public forum in our series of alcohol and human values. Today we present part 2 of loss, loneliness, and liquor, or alcoholism and the elderly. We're going to deal particularly with the effects and the possible solutions for the problem of alcoholism among the elderly. Last week we discussed the scope of the problem. This series is sponsored by the Association for the Humanities in Idaho and the Kootenai County Council on Alcoholism. However, the grant was prepared and is coordinated by today's panel, which includes Tim Christie, Judy Silty, and Jim McLeod. In order to continue part 2 of this program, we're happy to welcome back to our program the Reverend James E. Royce as our guest. He is a Jesuit priest, a professional psychologist, and the director of the Alcohol Studies program at Seattle University. He is a member of the Board of Directors of the National Council on Alcoholism and longtime member of the Executive Committee of the Washington State Council on Alcoholism. He was elected a Fellow of the American Psychological Association and has been president of 2 national psychology organizations. His 2 books have been translated into Spanish, and 1 has recently been translated into Italian. He also completed a comprehensive college-level textbook on alcoholism that will be published in 1980. Father Royce, welcome to our program. I also, as I indicated, have a panel that has been working on this grant for over 2 years, and I wish to welcome you to continue the questioning. First of all, Tim Christie is in the Division of Communication Arts, and he is in the field of speech, and also the debate coach at North Idaho College. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Tony.
Also, I wish to welcome Judy Silty, who teaches in the field of English and the whole area of composition and literature, and we welcome you once again to the program.
Thanks.
And Jim McLeod, who's been at North Idaho College. I believe he's starting his 10th year, and he is in the Department of English and also is well known in the field of literature with specialty in relation to certain aspects of literature and how that relates to politics. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Tony.
We will continue our question this evening on this subject, and we will ask Judy Silty to start the questioning.
Okay. Father Royce, we had a good bit of discussion last week about drinking among the elderly as a problem, but I just wonder, kind of half seriously and halfway for the sake of the argument, if we have to be so entirely negative about the whole business, can't we really argue after all that, especially after all the years that they've put in, retired folks have earned the right to do whatever they want to and just be sort of left alone about it? And wouldn't you say that there are any positive reasons at all for drinking at that age, or for that matter, at any other age?
I certainly do not want to come across as a prohibitionist, and I am a drinker myself. I'm not a teetotaler or total abstainer, and you're right. Many people, the vast majority of people, can drink alcoholic beverages all of their life. They may have some one occasion or the other where they get into a little difficulty, but by and large it is not habitual for them and therefore not a serious or lifetime problem. And I would agree. Alcohol can make, for some people, can make life pleasant, sociable, relaxed, and not create any serious problems. As I said last time, I think we have to remember that alcohol is a very peculiar drug in that people differ so much in their reaction to it that it gets quite unpredictable. I also mentioned that some people are more vulnerable than others, and I would like to point out that anybody probably who drinks hard enough and long enough could eventually become alcoholic or have serious drinking problem. So it isn't all a matter of biological vulnerability. It doesn't make any difference what your ancestry. Probably anybody could get into trouble, but also that some people are more likely to get into trouble than others. But you're right. Many people can drink that way. The trouble is here, I think, is that alcohol is pretty tricky in that it's a very easy area for us to deceive ourselves. And the people who aren't going to have any trouble usually don't have to make an issue of that fact. When a person starts saying, I can take it or leave it alone, I can quit anytime I want to, that's when I start to worry, because that indicates that they very possibly have a problem, because the person who truly can take it or leave it alone doesn't have to say so. Why does the person protest too much? And for that matter, why do they quit? A person who is truly a social drinker doesn't have to go on the water wagon, doesn't have to take off drinking periodically. I think that a lot of people don't realize that going on the water wagon is not a sign that they have it under control. Rather, this is a classic symptom of alcoholism. Another thing that is very often missed is the fact of high tolerance. We say, well, now you got to worry about Pete. He doesn't handle it very well, but Joe, he can drink everybody under the table, good old Joe. Well, the fact is that Joe isn't home free. Joe is the one who is in danger of becoming an alcoholic. The high tolerance is a bad sign, not a good sign. So it's this kind of self-deception and myths and folklore and misunderstandings that make me cautious about just saying, well, sure, alcohol's fine and everybody go ahead and enjoy it. But I certainly don't want to come across the idea that everybody must abstain, because, say, the majority of drinkers are quite capable of drinking in moderation.
Jim McLeod.
On the other hand, isn't it true that a lot of people who have no drinking problem throughout most of their lifetime run into major trouble with alcohol in their senior years?
Yes, there's no doubt about the fact that retirement, forced retirement, or even when not forced, or the death of a spouse, or a drastic change in lifestyle, or lowering of one's general level of living there. Sometimes it's attendant on having to live on pension or reduced salary and so forth. All of these can mean that there can be some very definite changes in the way a person reacts to alcohol, and whereas they could handle it, so to speak, during most of their life when they were active and busy, all of a sudden they're just bored and lonely, and now they turn to alcohol in very dangerous ways and creates real problems.
Tim Christie.
Father Royce, one of the members of our panel this afternoon, Dr. Fox, mentioned that one of the big problems is a combination of alcohol and drugs, and I think that deserves some attention in terms of your remarks, because I thought they were excellent today. And also, what other kind of problems, health-wise, does alcohol create for the person who is drinking, especially in terms of the agent?
Okay, first place, I want to clear that I'm a PhD, not an MD. I'm not a physician. Don't pretend to speak as one, but I have been working in the alcohol field for 30 years, and it's certainly true that we have to be very aware of the fact that alcohol, when mixed in the body, in the bloodstream, along with other drugs, creates very serious problems. And these, I'm not talking just about street drugs like heroin or marijuana or any of those, although those are dangerous too. But I think particularly the danger among the older people is the prescription drugs, and even some that are over-the-counter where you don't even need a prescription. But the antihistamines, for instance, that people use for their hay fever and their allergies, sleeping pills, which their doctor may give them, tranquilizers, Valium. Most people don't realize that alcohol is the #1 drug of misuse in this country, and Valium, not heroin, is the second worst drug problem in the United States. So it's these prescription drugs that create terrible problems when they are mixed with alcohol, and the reason is that the effects do not simply add. It isn't a question of 2 + 2 = 4 here, but rather 2 + 2 = 12, that the effect is not to add but to multiply, so that in addition to this fact, which we call potentiation or synergism, in the older people, they are less able to metabolize drugs, they are more prone to have a lot of pills around, and the doctors, maybe they are going to several different doctors, and the doctors prescribe some pills for them for sleep or weight control or whatever, anxiety, depression. And the first thing we know, these older people particularly, are taking, along with alcohol, which is one drug, another or perhaps 2 or 3. And say the net result is very, very dangerous. The side effects and medical complications are multiplied, and they're very subtle and create some very serious problems. In addition to the problems, the medical problems created by alcohol itself or alcohol in combination with other drugs, we have also many, many other complications that are very often not recognized as really complications of alcohol. For instance, many of the diseases of the digestive tract, the colitis and the ulcers and a lot of these things are actually alcohol related. Then you have broken bones, people falling, people who burn themselves, they fall asleep with a lighted cigarette or are otherwise careless. So there are many medical complications which are not always identified as alcohol related. Then there are other problems besides the the medical problems, either directly due to the alcohol or indirectly. For instance, when they are drinking, and they don't have to be drunk, but just when they're drinking more than they should, they get a little fuzzy, and they get, along with their perhaps pre-senile tendencies to be forgetful and everything, they get confused about their checkbook, they get their finances all messed up, they spend more on liquor and treating other people and so forth than they think they do, so that their finances get out of hand. They may antagonize people and lose a lot of friends, so that their social life is interfered with as a result of their drinking. So yes, the complications are many, and they're not all medical.
Jim McLeod.
Yes, I wanted to raise that question, Father Royce, about what about economic and social problems that are consequent?
Well, as I say, the cost of alcoholism, measured in dollars, is absolutely astronomical. We probably spend around $43 billion a year in the United States cleaning up the mess from the misuse of alcohol. But say getting down to the individual older person, very often I say it distorts the older person's finances in a way that the person just doesn't realize. And I say it creates a problem of poor relations with their friends. Sometimes their grandchildren or their children don't want to come and visit them so much because they're drinking too much. Or very often it isn't so much that people stay away from them, but that they withdraw from people. They end up watching TV alone in the seclusion of their home or their apartment, and they just withdraw from society generally, and they get very lonely, and it's a vicious circle, because the more they withdraw, the more lonely they are, and the more lonely they are, the more tendency there is to withdraw further. So it really creates all kinds of problems in their lives.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you've joined our program in progress, we are speaking with the director of the Alcohol Studies program at Seattle University, the Reverend James E. Royce. He also has just completed a textbook that is entitled Alcohol, the Respectable Drug, and that will be out in 1980 and will be available for classroom textbook instructions. At this point in our program, we would like to continue our questioning concerning alcoholism and the elderly and deal with the possible solutions. In order to deal with that subtopic, we will call on Judy Sildy.
Yes, Father Royce, obviously you're a priest as well as an academic, so I'm sure you've given a lot of thought to this question of possible solutions to the problem. What kind of caring responses can you suggest that we might make to the problem, either as a community or as individual neighbors?
Fortunately, there is a great deal that can be done, Judith, and this is one of the optimistic things that I'd like to say. We had a tendency in the past to think of the alcoholic as some kind of a hopeless person. Well, they may feel very hopeless, they get very discouraged, but actually there's a great deal of hope for the alcoholic. Many things can be done. There are clinics and information and referral centers and treatment centers, rehabilitation centers, outpatient services, and especially there's Alcoholics Anonymous, which doesn't cost anything, there's no charge, and it's all over the world. You look on the telephone book of any city, any size, anywhere in the world, and you'll find Alcoholics Anonymous. So there's a great deal that can be done, and many excellent programs. The problem is more to get these people to these programs, and sometimes we have to make a special effort of outreach in the case of the older alcoholic, because they are less prone to ask for help, and we have to go out to them rather than waiting for them to come to us. But there are ways of doing that, and if we can get them involved, they often become very, very happy people, and we discovered that the payoffs from drinking are much more costly and much less satisfying than the payoffs from their involvement in, say, a program like Alcoholics Anonymous, which is, although not affiliated with any particular religion, is a deeply spiritual program, a very beautiful program, and gives them a chance to investigate a lot of things that perhaps they've neglected during their busier years, like the spiritual side of their lives.
Kim Christie.
Father Royce, one of the perhaps lights at the end of the tunnel is that in the near future, the demographics of the country, because of population shifts and things like that, is going to be that there is going to be larger populations of older senior citizens, if you might. Do you think that this, in and of itself, is going to raise the consciousness of the American public concerning the problem of alcoholism and in terms of the senior citizens and the aged, and perhaps provide more insight into what the problem is and how to deal with it?
I would certainly expect so. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't predict the future. But I would expect that, in line with your question, yes, that as a larger percentage of our population becomes in the upper age brackets, we are going to see more attention paid to the problem. It's going to be spoken of more openly, and especially with that note of optimism that I sounded, where, for instance, doctors now who 30 years ago, physicians were saying, oh, I don't like to treat alcoholics, they just get drunk again and so forth. Now these same, or maybe not these same physicians, but other physicians are saying, oh, I like to treat alcoholics because they get well. Other patients die, but alcoholics get well, and it's great to see them come back. And certainly that's one of the gratifications in my work over the last 30 years, is to see people come back and start feeling better and looking better and getting friends and joining, let's say, Alcoholics Anonymous, and generally their whole quality of their life improving. And this is very encouraging, and I think, as you suggest in your question, when the population shifts to a greater percentage of those in the older years, that's going to make it more acceptable for more people to get involved in this kind of thing.
Jim McLeod.
Father Royce, I'm a little pessimistic about who will foot the bill for costly studies or treatment programs, et cetera, for the elderly. It would seem that big business, although they are in the rehabilitation business in some cases, for instance, the telephone company I know in this area and in Spokane has done a lot of work with alcoholism, is probably not going to be too sympathetic to providing programs for people who are no longer their employees and are retired. So I suppose this is a pretty crass question, but what economic value do we place on our retired citizens as a result of that?
Okay, I would agree with the implication of your question that there are other values except the crass materialistic ones, but even looking at it in terms of dollars. Number one, as I mentioned, Alcoholics Anonymous doesn't cost anything. Secondly, a lot of these programs can be combined with our existing facilities. We don't have to go and build a whole lot of new facilities for our older people. It's a question of getting the staffs of our nursing homes and our hospitals better trained to understand the problems that are related with alcohol and know better how to handle it. It's a question of getting AA into these various housing projects and nursing homes and so forth, having meetings. It's also, I think it's important to realize that treatment for the alcoholism, even when there is a charge, is probably the cheapest thing that you can do for an alcohol problem. Almost anything else, including drinking, is more expensive. Accidents are expensive. The senior citizen who falls and breaks a hip, for instance, and is laid up in the hospital in a cast for months, that's much more expensive than treating the alcoholism. The ruptured gastric ulcer, any of these things are more costly than treating the alcoholism, even when there is a charge. So I never could quite understand the logic of insurance companies, for instance, who seem to be willing to pay out $20,000 to treat the complications of alcoholism rather than $2,000 or $3,000 to treat the alcoholism itself. It seems to me they're going to save $17,000, but that's too simple arithmetic for them, I guess.
Tim Christie.
Okay, Father Royce, what do you think are some of the most effective things? Now, I know you've mentioned like Alcoholics Anonymous and things like this. What do you think are some of the most effective tools for dealing with the alcohol problem? And I guess another question that deals somewhat with Jim's is the idea that, and some people have this attitude very unfortunately, isn't the senior citizen too old to really be helped?
Well, it's true. Let's be very honest. There are some very old alcoholics, what we call brain damaged, where there is actual physical deterioration of the brain cells, which is irreparable. It's irreversible. And for some of these people, there isn't a great deal that can be done except custodial care. I say that not to sound pessimistic, but to just be honest. I'm not saying that everybody is just automatically going to get 100% well and everything's going to be lovely. But having said that, that's only a small percentage. I feel that the vast majority of them can respond to the proper kind of help. As I say, our big problem is to get them to the help or to bring the help to them. But I say there's a great deal to be done. I think one of the major things, again, is changing attitudes, both the attitudes of the old people themselves toward all of this, getting them to accept the fact that this is something that they don't really want and isn't helping them, and they will be a lot happier without the drinking problems. Getting society to change its attitudes. I mentioned the insurance companies, the physicians, the staffs of hospitals and treatment centers and so forth. A lot of attitude changes. There are a lot of things that can be done. I think one of the most important things, and not just because I am a clergyman as well as a psychologist, is the fact that a program like Alcoholics Anonymous is a deeply spiritual program. And one of the greatest psychiatrists in the world once said that no person in the latter half of life is ever really going to adjust to their personality problems unless and until they have rediscovered God. That some form of religion, and AA is very careful not to dictate how we think of God any way that the person wants to understand, and that's fine. But some notion of the spiritual, the supernatural, something beyond the material, something beyond this life, seems to be essential if people are going to be at peace with themselves or achieve some kind of serenity in their later years. And I think it's very important that these people who are so discouraged, helpless, powerless, confused, anxious,
is to be aware of how I am being affected at the